If anybody was ever going to doubt that God was in Christian education, they've only got to talk to anybody who was there in the pioneering years.
Welcome to the podcast today. We are going to talk about the phenomena of faith-based Christian education, especially in Queensland since the late 1970s. This is a riveting topic, and I've got two great guests with me today, Pastor Glen Cochrane and Dr. Craig Murison. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you for your time. You guys are both known as eminent statesmen in the Christian education, faith-based, linked to spirit-filled churches here in Queensland. So I can't wait for our listeners to hear the insights and hear some of the stories of miracles and the marvel of this phenomena called Christian education. So can you both start with a quick summary of your involvement in faith-based education over your career? Over to you, Glenn.
Thanks, Andrew. Statesman, I need to maybe back off from that a little bit. My involvement in Christian education started not long after I became a Christian. I became a Christian in Townsville back in 1984. Then not long after that came down to Brisbane and started attending Northside Christian Family, which is now Nexus Church. And the school had just started, I think, the year before. And so I was able to witness the beginnings of that school and the growth of that school. Everything in those days was done on the smell of an oily rag. So everyone in the church was involved in paving different areas, putting boards up in classrooms and all of that. So there's a real kind of exciting, kind of pioneering sense to that as well. So initially involved in that, eventually went on to the board of Northside Christian College. Worked for 3 years as the State Executive Officer of Christian Schools Australia. And also...
That was like a peak body.
Christian Schools Australia was a peak body representing independent Christian schools in Australia. And so did that for 3 years and remained on the board of Northside for some time, and more recently was on the board of Toowoomba Christian College. Also did a diploma in education after becoming a Christian. So that's my experience in education, my experience with Christian schooling.
Right. Great.
So I trained to be a teacher in the late 70s, early 80s, because I had a call of God on my life to be a minister. And in my mind, I saw that as being a pastor. And I saw that as the narrow sort of way that you understand that. But over time, God changed that. I went out teaching in state schools for a couple of years. I'm an English history geography teacher, the only geography teacher in the history of Blackwater State High School to get lost on Blackdown Tableland and have the ranger come searching for him. And in 1983, God called me into Christian education. I applied for Bible college, was accepted, but God spoke to me about what ministry really was, and that ministry was broader than the way that we perhaps imagine it. And I went to Mackay and in response to a call, and at the age of 22 I started a Christian school in a church where we set up school on Sunday nights after the service and packed away.
Like from scratch, school from scratch?
Yeah, scratch. We started with 17 children, my wife and I, in grades 1 to 7. And I was there for 33 years as school principal and grew that school to over 1,100 students across 2 campuses in that time. I'm currently in 2017, time really flies, God called me away from that, and I started at Christian Heritage College as Dean of Education and have gone through a series of positions. I'm not prepared to give up the Dean of Education, though, because that's the love of my life. But I'm now the Executive Dean and Chief Academic Officer there. I think, the standout thing for me in all of that is just the variety of experiences that I was then able to have. Back in the day, Mackay was a long way away from Brisbane. The Bruce Highway didn't even go all the way to Mackay. And an air ticket was very expensive. So when you travelled to Brisbane for meetings, I would stay 2 or 3 days and I'd go and visit people, talk to them, really try to explore what Christian education was. And over that time, I've served on many boards, many school boards. I'm currently on 4 school boards and just have such a passion for it.
And CHC, School of Education, produces dozens and dozens of graduates every year to feed the needs of this phenomenon of independent Christian schools.
Yeah, our graduates teach in state schools, Catholic schools, Lutheran schools, but that's right. Its core purpose is around well-formed, passionate Christian teachers to teach in Christian schools. And it does a great job of that.
What do you think, gentlemen, is distinctively Christian education? And even why did we have to have this phenomena called independent Christian schools, right? Because I grew up in a state school, Runcorn State School, 7 years, Murriga High School 5. But I knew this phenomena was bubbling around. So why distinctively Christian education?
For me, I think the thing that stands out about Christian education and the thing that makes it distinctly different is our commitment to that overall biblical story, the meta-narrative, a true story from Genesis to Revelation of God's creation and of God's dealing with humanity and, of course, where we're going. And I think that God's story of creation, of the fall, of redemption, and then restoration, consummation, everything that's to come, I think a commitment to that story, knowing that it's a true story, it's an overarching story, that story answers a lot of questions. Answers the 4 big philosophical questions of life. Where do we come from? What's the purpose of life? How do we live and where are we going? So the questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And I think I know it's that Christian story that answers those questions for me completely. We are created in the image of God, which gives us purpose, which gives us direction. We know how to live from the scriptures, from the Holy Spirit, and we know where we're going. We know that the whole Christian story tells us that we are heading towards a destination. Now, central to that story, of course, is the key event in all of history, is the birth, the life, the death, the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. So that whole story is really, the story points towards the coming of Christ and then how we live in light of that. So when we have that commitment to that story, we know that we're here for a bigger purpose than ourselves. And so as Christians, it's like we talk about the head, the heart and the hand, where we're kind of, in terms of the head, there is knowledge that is being passed on, to students. And it's the knowledge of the world, it's the knowledge of everything, what normal, just standard education does. But then there's the heart as well. As a Christian, there's a heart engagement with this overarching story. And then that must lead to something. It doesn't stop with it. That's where the hands come in. There's an expression then. So we're created in the image of God with a sense of purpose to do things, for the glory of God and for his kingdom. So I think that is what sets Christian education apart, and that makes it distinctly different.
The teaching is through a Bible-based, Christ-centered, Spirit-infused worldview.
Worldview. It's all to do with your worldview.
Yeah. Oh, I agree with that. It might be worth just pausing and reflecting on the history of where it came from. There are a couple of Christian schools, genuine Christian schools in Australia that are now over 100 years old, out of the Dutch Reform movement, one in Perth and one in Tasmania that I know of. But the modern movement that we refer to as the Christian school movement was the mid-70s, started in the mid-70s with Regent's Park Christian Community School in Sydney, where a couple of gentlemen really got together to just work out what it meant to be Christian and to live in community and learn in community. And most of the Christian schools in Australia started in a window of time where government policy made it easier to start schools, but also at a time where government imposition on education in the state system was beginning to bring in a different moral perspective and forcing it on families. Manor course of study and SEMP were introduced and were going to be made compulsory by the federal government. And parents responded to that in churches and said, no, we don't want our children exposed to that. And so there was, in a sense, a fear base that prompted the start of many Christian schools. And that's now matured and grown into much more what the understanding of what Glenn has described, that it's not as much about protection at all. It's actually about the formation of wonderful Christian young adults. Christian schooling has also moved largely from being exclusively for the families, Christian families and Christian children, to more an understanding that if you talk about that worldview that we were talking about before, if we can impart elements of that Christian worldview and that Christian way of thinking into children who may not yet have found Christ, they will live their lives differently.
It's true.
And so it's taken on a social transformation element. And I think we can see it in the political history of Australia, the impact of Christian schools, the graduates of Christian schools, that would not have occurred if we did not have Christian schools in Australia.
Because there'd be some parents who don't have an active faith, but they're looking for values-based education, aren't they?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think and more increasingly, that I would call was almost a nostalgic reason. I remember why. My parents sent me to Sunday school. I want my children brought up this way. I think we're actually moving into I don't want this. Yeah. I see what's now being taught, what our society in political correctness, in wokeness, and all of those things is now embracing. And I want my children to be able to think about those things and reach their own conclusions. And I know it sounds counterintuitive to what the narrative in the media is, but young people have got a much better chance of being able to think critically and come to their own decisions about things if they're in a Christian school than they do if they're in a state school.
Yeah,
completely.
I know for our movement, the INC movement, they saw schooling, strategic education as a part of discipling families, discipling Australian society, as part of a reformation agenda to establish the Christian values that many think our nation was formed on.
Yeah.
Powerful stuff. So this is some of the reasons why our churches, our faith-based and spirit-filled churches have got involved. Like you started Mackay, I think, Glenn, your church pastor, Pastor John Lewis, he went and saw your pastor, didn't you, Craig? What was that about?
They may have actually already started at Northside. I'm just reflecting on that. But he came to have a look to see why we were doing what we were doing. Not so much how we were doing it, but why, so that he could get a better understanding of what the motivation was there. And I'm sure he visited other places that had schools as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for Northside, John Lewis was the senior pastor. A gentleman by the name of Graham Corney was the driving force. He incredibly capable, incredibly articulate, and incredibly intelligent man. He just saw the real need for Christian schooling, Christian education. And so he was the driving force, I know, at Northside, with the support of the church and, Pastor John Lewis and the eldership. But it was, I think, the head office for the college was in Graham's kind of dining room for quite
Well, he
a
was
few
a solicitor
years.
too, wasn't he?
He was
a legal man, a learned man,
yes.
and a good family man.
Whereas from my point of view, I was teaching high school, and I was conscious of the fact that I was teaching things that I didn't agree with, that I was leading young people to be able to accept truth that I knew was not truth, and I had to get out of it. And my new wife, we'd been married about 6 months, and I sat and thought, where would we send our children to school? And we actually couldn't think of anywhere. So when the opportunity came to go and start one, that's what we did. Yeah. And I'm not saying it was perfect in any way, but my son and daughter went all the way through that school, and I have this enormous pleasure now when I go and visit Mackay of walking my granddaughter dressed in the uniform I designed, the logo I designed, onto a premises that I bought, and I'll say I loosely because obviously it's a big team, into buildings I built and handing her over to teachers who I employed. And it's just the greatest joy of my life to know that my granddaughter's being exposed to that quality education.
Yeah. We open with a statement. There's been a phenomena that's happened in Queensland, especially southeast Queensland, where spirit-filled churches have wanted to get in and pioneer education ministries around faith-based education. What have you seen in that time through your various roles?
Look, probably the thing that immediately comes to mind is the hand of God, the hand of God on it. If anybody was ever going to doubt that God was in Christian education, they've only got to talk to anybody who was there in the pioneering years, and I'd say anybody who's there now, and ask them what God's doing. The miracles that occurred, the ability to buy land where land wasn't available, council's favour for external infrastructure costs, parents willing to take the risk to enrol their children in what was an unknown entity, the growth that occurred, the staffing availability, the miracle after miracle after miracle occurred. And then it's the graduates. We look at our graduates. We look at the positions of political positions. Probably the thing that impresses me the most is the quality of parent they are, that they make decisions about their kids. And one story stands out where this young man who had really been a problem in the school, he used to surf the bonnets of motor vehicles to see how fast he could go. He put an axe into his mother's front door on one day. He sheepishly came into my office with his children and said, "Mr. Murison, I want to enrol my children in your school." And I know you probably don't want to take them. and that, to me, that's just a great story. And by the time I left Mackay, I had my first grandchild of a student enrolling. And that generational trust that got put into us, that's something else I really observed.
Yeah, all of that is so true. I think probably the thing that stands out for me was this sense of like different churches, different denominations working together, particularly within the school community and the school environment, the sharing of resources, the support of one another. And I think a whole lot of things lined up, didn't they, Craig? There was the access to government funding. I think there was that real sense and that need, to provide Christian education for people, Christians and non-Christians, and that sense of cooperation and people working together, kind of made the whole better than each individual.
It's so true.
And I think time and time again, I saw that with people starting schools and the sharing of resources, the generosity, of people in churches, of pastors, of parents, of just over and over again, people donating their time. Again, back to the start of the podcast, I remember at Northside, paving whole areas a whole weekend, and there'd be 10 people from the church and, parents out there doing, and there was a real sense of community. There's a real sense of excitement too about what the potential, about what God could do, what the Holy Spirit could do through us working together in this way, and creating
such an adventure, Andrew. It's such an adventure, and it still is. Again, if you look at the media and you just read what's in the newspapers, you would think the risk of losing government funding or some of the moral issues that our society is facing are placing Christian schools at risk, where in fact the evidence is they're growing, and they're growing at a faster rate than other independent schools and a much faster rate than state schools, because parents are seeing this is what they want.
Well, when we were in Canberra recently, someone pitched the question to the current Education Minister, Jason Clare, didn't he? Have you noticed, sir, there is a trend away from state school education?
Yeah.
Surely this is on your radar. Yes, it is. Yeah.
But I think the reality is, and this is not meant to be a plug for CHC School of Ministries in any way. Maybe it is.
Thank you,
it's
friend.
not. It's not really.
Plug it.
But the biggest risk to Christian schooling is not those things. It's actually the lack of Christian teachers to teach in them.
Yeah.
The formation of those people. And we really need it. You can't be a Christian school if you're not employing Christian teachers. And not only that, you can't grow as a Christian school if those teachers are not growing in their understanding of their identity and who they are in Christ.
Talk to me about the excellence, because there was increasing excellence in what was being delivered, and you collaborated, and then there was accreditation processes and boards, and then the non-state schools accreditation body would give feedback on how you were going. Talk to us about sort of excellence and development of best practice.
Well, just speaking from my experience, Andrew, with Christian Schools Australia for a brief period of time, when I came into the role as State Executive Officer, CSAQ, Christian Schools Australia Queensland, had developed their own, accreditation was required, had to report to government under the Non-State Schools Accreditation Board. And CSAQ had drawn on all of their resources and expertise, which when you put it together is pretty incredible, Craig. Yeah. It's an amazing resource, and had developed their own a very thorough accreditation program. And this was a program that CSAQ embarked upon voluntarily. So they developed the program, and then different people on the board of CSAQ would gather together. We'd visit different schools and talk them through it and work through the accreditation process. And I think that it contributed so much to the professionalism and excellence that even exists in Christian schools as Australia today. And I saw that again, the professionalism, and I was constantly amazed. Also amazed at the experience of individual school principals and educationalists working in Christian education. Dr. Craig, I soon kind of discovered would have to be one of the leading Christian educationalists, if not educationalists, just educationalist in Australia. I mean, he was on every board that opened and shut, and he was invited on all of those boards because there's a recognition of his expertise. And I think there was incredible confidence in working with, these school principals who had done the hard yards, who had studied, who had incredible experience within education and, within Christian schooling. And when they pooled all of those resources, I think it was that pooling and that desire to be on the cutting edge, because I know what CSAQ did in those days. None of the other faith-based school movements had even embarked on that process at that stage. Catholic education may have been down the road, but I think at that time, the accreditation process and program that we instituted here in Queensland was a little bit further ahead.
Yeah, we made a determination early on as a group of principals. So it all started as a fellowship. It didn't formalise until somebody from the Commonwealth Government actually came and spoke to us at Northside and said, look, the government's changing the way it operates. It wants to deal with peak bodies. You guys need to incorporate and become an association. And that happened in about 1988. I've got the original minutes hanging on my office wall. And so we did that. But that fellowship base and friendship base to this day remains the core of what makes Queensland Christian education quite unique. A group of guys and ladies who did life together, who shared deep personal stories of what they were experiencing, who were vulnerable and transparent to one another about mistakes they made. It took a long while, to build that depth of relationship. And I can remember a particular moment at a conference in Canberra where one of the principals who I felt a bit intimidated by, and I didn't like touring his school because whenever I went back, my place looked so shabby compared with what he was able to build in his school, where he just sat down at breakfast with a group of us and shared about a problem with his son. And it was like, it was the most natural thing for him to do, to talk to us about that. And I just thought, this is so good. So good. We could ring somebody and say, I've really blown it. Yeah. I've stuffed it with a parent.
I think it's a phenomenon of kingdom collaboration. It's a wonderful, it's like a miracle. It's the family. So why Queensland? Queensland, is it work better in Queensland for any reason? Like, are we mavericks?
I can't say it worked better. I don't know that it worked better. It worked differently. And from our point of view, that was better. And the schools in Queensland, and this is not true anymore, but they grew large quickly. A lot of the schools in the southern states remained quite small, but there were more of them. So there's some ways that's better because you're getting into more communities. But it was different. It was a decentralised, exactly what you're saying. It was a collaborative effort. It transcended denominational barriers. If there were issues between denominations, they never even got a mention or caused a concern between the people at that table. It's like this transcendent idea of that common purpose and that common vision that we were impacting Australia. We were having an impact in our society and beyond, and we were doing it together.
And that rippled through families and communities in the state. Talk to me about the relationship with Christian faith-based education with the government, because in other places that's been quite adversarial. How have you seen it the last 40 years?
Oh, we made a decision to not fight battles that weren't battles that needed to be fought. Okay. And so we built, and I guess longevity in communities like myself in Mackay, I was on a first name basis with the local, state and federal parliamentarians and council members. So I think we built a reputation of standing by what we believed, of not shrinking away from what we believed, but not judging if somebody else believed something different to us. We weren't better, we were different. And if that difference made us the place for that child, then that was great. Yeah. If that difference wasn't what that family was looking for, that's okay. And I think where that occurred pretty much universally in Queensland, a sense of, I guess there's a lot of what the Government Department of Education does is good. You walk into a normal classroom, you're going to see the same things in a Christian school you do in a state school. You're going to see LED screens these days, whiteboards, I used to say blackboards, whiteboard markers, chairs, desks, carpet, walls. That's right. You're going to see the same things, right? But the massive difference is the fundamental purpose, the why behind what we're doing. Yeah. Now, I know there are Christian teachers called to state schools who have that why in that context. I don't hear me saying something else. But a teacher in a Christian school believes that every student in their care, every person they're working with, everybody in their community is a unique creation of a God who loves them and has a plan and a purpose for their lives. And that belief ought to substantially and does substantially change the way you relate and behave towards one another. And that's the ethos and spirit that comes in that and makes that difference there. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question, Andrew, but I kind of talked around it in a fairly good way, I think.
I think he answered it pretty well. I do think that, particularly with Christian Schools Australia, CSAQ, and I know now, part of the role of people who were, like, I was employed as a state executive officer, and part of my mandate was to develop good relationships with government, with the Minister of Education, shadow ministers, and Department of Education. And that was seen as something, a positive thing that was part of the role.
Yeah. One of the other decisions we made in Queensland was that we would join the Independent Schools Queensland, and that was different than some other states where they made a decision, we won't be part of that, we will be separate to that. And so in that way, we collaborated and cooperated and benefited from other independent schools, Lutheran schools, some Catholic independent schools. I don't think there are any more in ISQ, there might be, but Seventh-day Adventist schools, a range of other denominationally based, faith-based schools. And we made a commitment not to duplicate what they were doing unless it impacted on our distinctive. And we pretty much have stayed true to that. So they don't see us as a threat to what they're trying to do.
Well, even more than that, I think Christian schools have added to ISQ, because over the years, I mean, there have been different Christian school principals, on the board of ISQ, and playing kind of pretty important roles within that board.
Chaired their committees. Yeah,
exactly. So
they do a great job. They've got some fantastic resources, especially in corporate governance. We use that. I was chairman of Brisbane Christian College for 5 years, and let's talk about miracles. Our sector is characterised by supernatural provision and breakthrough. I remember when we had a project, we were able to go through miraculous and some good advice and some amazing wisdom. We were able to go and buy the old Nyanda High School property, the old Salisbury High School, miracle. And Pastor Jeff Blight and Sean Morrison done a fantastic job out of there. But our sector is characterised by remarkable acts and favour. What have you seen?
Oh, I've got so many stories you wouldn't believe. I think probably the one that stands out in my mind from a Mackay perspective is that we grew too big for the property we were on. It was a very small church property, and we went looking for property, and it was too expensive. We didn't have any money. And we went looking, and we found back in the day 160,000, 120,000. Now this is mid to late 80s, so it doesn't sound like a lot of money when you're talking about property today, but it was a lot of money.
Back then.
It was beyond our ability to do. We found this one particular block, and it was on the market. I think it was started at 160,000, and over a couple of weeks we noticed that the price dropped. So we went and offered what we could afford, 38,000, and it was accepted. It was accepted. And we walked onto that property and very quickly freeheld it with no debt. Now that's a miracle, an absolute miracle. I know a friend of ours who started a school down here in Brisbane wasn't able to get permission to grow his school beyond a certain site because of a sewage issue. And they were doing major roadworks past his school, and he just went down and spoke to the foreman. And he said to the foreman, listen, I've got two things. Can I put a trench down the middle of your road? And the guy said, yeah, sure. Solve one problem, number one. Number two, you're carting all that dirt away. How much are you paying per cubic metre to dump that? How about you just drive it up the hill and dump it up there, and I'll get a couple of good ovals out of that.
That's what happened up at Suncoast. The pastor was walking backwards and forwards on the property that got up there at Woombye and praying and got a prophetic word like that. There's these rocks will cry out and worship me. And soon after, Main Roads Department approached them. They'd done some soil tests, and that land was needed. The dirt that was going to be was needed for some major development works up through there. And so they excavated all through rock, and literally the whole school site was levelled and prepared through strategic prayer and the provision of God.
I think, if I can, Glenn, sorry. No, I think the biggest miracles for me, though, are not about objects or property, they're about people.
People, yeah.
And, the lives that have been changed and transformed, lives that have been shifted onto a different track than they would have been. I could tell you stories about lives that were saved, as in they would have died had they not come to our school. I know that sounds far-fetched, but it's true. And just to see now, I run into graduates of Mackay Christian College in the most unusual places, in shopping centres, and, hey, Mr. Murison, generally I don't have a clue who they are. So my wife has to tell me who they are. And then I hear their stories. It's amazing. It's amazing.
What about the story about the principals praying for money? Where was that? Down in Victoria?
It was. There was a school, probably one of the earliest Christian schools to start. It was a 100% boarding school. It had a lot of international students in it. It was quite small. So when I say a lot, a proportion of its enrolments. And it got challenged by the state government that about its registration or its accreditation. And the criticism was it was too Christian. And the principal and the staff set themselves to pray about what it meant to be Christian and decided they weren't Christian enough. So the government made a decision to close them, and it went to court. And the court found that the government was right, but there was no penalty, see you later. And they continued as a school. But in the midst of that, it was the local families who abandoned them because of the media, because of the reputational damage. And the international students were there. And there came a day when the next mortgage payment was going to be due for the property, and they didn't have the money, they didn't have the income. And the principal and staff got together and said, we're going to have to tell the students and the parents we're shutting the school down. And they prayed and they cried together, and they called an assembly, and they went to talk to the students. And it didn't have a hall, so it's a parade outside. And the principal's trying to gather himself emotionally to tell the students. And I heard this from the principal, so this is going to sound so unbelievable, but I heard it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And a light plane flew over, and a bag fell out of the plane. And somebody rushed to get the bag, and it was exactly the money they needed for the next mortgage payment. And they didn't have to close the school.
A money drop, falling from the sky.
It was. It was just unbelievable story. And I've never forgotten it. See the tears running down that principal's eyes as he told that story.
Many of our schools have testified to miraculous provision or being able to acquire land when apparently there was no land or a big fat no.
Well, that's true. I did know of a church school combination here in Queensland, and one of the neighbours next door to that church and to that school certainly didn't like what was happening on the property and took issue with the church. And it was back in the days pre-air conditioning, if you can imagine that at the moment. I mean, I don't know how we survived without air conditioning, but anyway, we did. And in churches, the sermons were a little bit longer back in those days too, I think, Andrew. But I remember in this church, they would tell the story of sitting there, and the minute the worship was over and the pastor began to preach, the next door neighbour who took issue with the church would start up his motorboat and would just rev it for 15 or 20 minutes. I know the church and school made an approach to him, to obviously realising he's not happy to purchase that property, but he declined. He said, virtually over my dead body, I won't sell. And a few years later, it went to market. It didn't sell, and then it was put up for auction, and the school went in and made an offer anonymously and bought that block of land for a lot cheaper than the amount they originally offered. And he wasn't really happy, but it was just an amazing provision too, because it was just the block that was required at that time. But, I come back to what Craig said. I think the real miracles are in the individuals and the people. And, I even talking about, Graham Corney before, who had this heart and this passion, to educate young people, educate Christians, and to see them take a role in society. And the story of one of the students who went through, who later went on to tertiary study, became a lawyer like Graham, and then ended up working for Graham for a few years, and now has his own law practice. And you see that. I mean,
there's hundreds of stories like that.
There are just thousands of stories like that. And I think one day all of those stories, I know they're written down somewhere, and we'll get to read them. We'll be just amazed at the miraculous provision of God.
Well, other people have marvelled, haven't they? People looking in. What have you heard other people say about this phenomenon of what they've said gone on?
Well, I think there are quite a few. I remember when I first came into the role with CSAQ, there was a Korean educationalist, Dr. Kim.
Joseph Kim.
Joseph Kim, who had visited Australia from Korea and made particular comments about what he saw in Christian education in Queensland, but particularly southeast Queensland. And I think part of that too was because of our access to government funding, thanks to the Catholics in the 1950s back in Goulburn. But I think that combined with a whole lot of other factors that the Lord all brought together made something distinctly different about what happened in Christian education in southeast Queensland and Queensland, in the 70s and in those years. And observing as an outsider, he was astounded at what he saw the Lord do through churches and through Christian education. And he made that comment that, to those who have been, much is given, much is required. And he kind of gave us that mandate, didn't he, when he left. So I think, that's one of many people who've made those comments like that.
It's even the phenomenon at 322 Wecker Road, Carindale. I mean, portion of late 90s, a portion was sold off to developers to finalise the debt. But you've got 100 acres of land there with a global focused church. You've got early childhood, Peter 12 school, Christian higher education, CHC there. Literally, it's quite a phenomenon. Other people have come in and said it's very hard to find another model or expression of that on that scale in other places in the world. So it really is something quite sovereign, isn't it? Yeah.
Most certainly,
yeah. So what do you think are some of the essentials or the success factors to making this version of ministry, faith-based education, especially in spirit-filled churches, how do we keep the consistent quality from generation to generation? What do we need?
That probably swings a little bit off the back of Glenn's comments around the accreditation process, that the accountability idea, that the notion of we know what good quality is, or we think we do. We need to keep learning about the latest in good quality and not necessarily to adopt it, sometimes to reject it and stick with what we're doing, but to know. And it is things like the accreditation looked at. Good governance is absolutely key, and governance is actually, along with Christian teachers, is one of the biggest risks to Christian schools and to all independent schools. And governance in the model of schools is so different. There are independent Christian schools that have started with no connection to a church, who need to work to retain their Christian identity in different ways. There are Christian schools that have been started as ministry arms of churches, and there's just about everything in between. And at the end of the day, and I remember Graham Corney, I was listening to Graham Corney speak, saying that it doesn't really matter what model you've got, the quality of relationships that you build in that model are what make it work or not work.
Yeah.
He used to say, the day you've got to bring out your constitution, you've actually got a problem.
Yeah.
I think you really shouldn't do that. I say that having been reading CHC's constitution yesterday, but not because I had a problem. So governance is one. I think right seat on the bus for people and the bus going in the right direction. So was it Sam Chan says, proper people placement prevents problems. So that idea of round pegs in round holes, operating to the notion of if somebody's not in the right place, move them in place.
And some people are good for a season too, aren't they? So it's getting our people ready to say, like when you feel like the level of your contribution that's needed for that phase of the growth of a ministry education expression, that's a time to self-assess yourself. It's time to transition.
I think clarity of vision is really, really important. And there are, while every Christian is going to ultimately ask the question, why, to love God and, glorify Him forever, eventually you're going to come to something like that. How that's outworked in your mission, how you do that is different. And that's true of Christian schools too. There are Christian schools that are genuinely called to be very evangelical.
Yeah.
Bring in the lost, seek to move them on whatever the continuum of from lack of God consciousness through to discipling others into heaven. There are Christian schools who are genuinely called to serve more the children of Christian families. And there are a whole heap of a growing number of Christian schools who actually see themselves as where the rubber meets the road for the church, a little bit like your Goodwill shop would be or any other care. We're providing a choice of Christian education to the community, and a school's got a sense of permanency around it. We're here. And Australians are hungry for community, and they find that in clubs in Australia more than they do in churches these days. but they find it over the bonnet of a car when they're dropping their kids off or picking them up. They find it in the drama activity. They find it in that common interest in the future of their children.
Yeah.
So, schools become a way to engage families with the gospel who would never otherwise engage them. And one of the risks I always think is when churches have got schools, see those schools as a mechanism of growing their own congregation, they're likely to be disappointed. They're a mechanism to grow the kingdom. They're actually a mechanism to grow other people's congregations as much, if not more. We used to say in Mackay, I want every youth group in Mackay filled. I just want ours filled first.
And Christian education sort of lifts the level of the spirituality in a community as well. I like what you said before about clarity, because it's a different mindset to lead a church than it is to lead a school, isn't it?
There are different
and that's often where we see some challenges or some frictions.
Yeah, there's often, not always, but more often than not, a lot more money in a school than there is in a church because of government funding. And so there's all of the things that come with what a school can do that a church might not be able to do. And finding the ways to get the synergies of that and that symbiotic relationship working within regulatory frameworks, not doing anything morally or ethically wrong. A school can be an enormous blessing to a church, but a church can be an enormous blessing to a school.
It's meant to be a symbiotic relationship.
I think it's the best model by a country mile, but I think it's the hardest model to make work well.
Because you've got to collaborate. To me, a success factor is a relationship between the senior pastor and the school principal. Yeah. No matter what model you work, I've seen that both work and not work. But it's the leaning into the kingdom entrepreneurial generous mindset, which has been the hallmark of this phenomenon. Glenn?
It all comes down to relationships.
Yeah, 100%.
And one of the questions you would get asked all the time is, what's the best model of governance and what's the best pattern that you've seen? But it's like, well, anyone can work if you've got the if you've got the right people involved. And it always comes down to relationships, because I've seen really good models of governance fall because of lack of relationship.
I think another answer to your question of how this is sustainable and how it can move forward, if I understood your question correctly, is actually about keeping the main game. Yeah. And recognising that a school is not a church. Now, biblically, we can argue about what church is, but in terms of our understanding of church, it's not. It's not a church, and it can't be a church. Its goals are different. So while I would say our aims are primarily, 100%, the main aim is kingdom, and main aim has to be kingdom. Our mechanism is education. So we need to be providing a high-quality maths curriculum, a high-quality English, a high-quality science. We need to be value-adding to students so that their progression, whether they're low academic or high academic, they are moving forward academically or in their vocational calling because they're in our schools. And that has to be the main game.
That's one of the hallmarks of our schools is there's probably extra money in learning support and teacher aides and things like that in terms of getting students academically stronger. Yes,
I don't know that that's universally true, but it is largely true across our schools, that families whose kids have needs are drawn to schools who care. And love is a hallmark of a Christian.
Wow.
It's the measure of it. Yeah.
So good. I like that point you made about the collaboration, the relationships, Glenn. I think a real long-term example of that is the phenomena at King's College there. They've got campuses at Reedy Creek, Pimpama, Logan Village.
And they've got more on the books.
It's like an education
kept secret.
But what Reese and Brennan have done there with Pastor Ben Natoko for decades has been a wonderful example of this symbiotic relationship and bringing mutual blessing.
Oh, in my view, they've taken it to the level it needs to be at, right? You're actually, instead of, and this is when I say churches and schools are different, this is a great example. They're planting schools and starting churches.
Yeah.
Just think about that for a minute.
Yeah.
Because that's not our natural inclination.
It's normally the other way around.
It's the other way around.
Yeah.
It's the other way around.
Yeah.
And to me, when you've got the sort of resources that King's has access to and that can be spent within government boundaries on the education of the children, why would you not do this?
Yeah.
It's a great model.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. I just love it.
It's good. Now, pivoting, challenges. What's the future look like? What are you guys working on, or trying to sandbag, or got your fire extinguishers out on, or what are you seeing in the future?
I think one of the, and Craig's alluded to it, I think one of the greatest challenges is because of the growth, astronomical growth within the Christian school sector still today, keeping up with that growth with committed, qualified Christian teachers. Because one of the things that makes a Christian school distinctly different are the Christian teachers who are employed, and really that's something that we've committed to for as long as I can remember talking about Christian schooling. That the medium is the message in a sense as well. So I really believe that one of the challenges is going to be enough Christian teachers who are committed to and see it as a call, and it is. This is just not an occupation.
No.
Well, for Christians, anything we do is vocational rather than occupational. But I think even more so, if that's possible, I think for Christian teachers. So I think that encouragement, that development of younger people to think about, to pray about, and to consider education, and then particularly Christian education. I mean, I love what Craig said before. There are Christian teachers who are committed to the state system because God has called them there. And I guess our prayer would be that God would be speaking to a lot of younger people. Well, not just younger people. I think I went to uni at a little bit older.
Career changes as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, early 30s is a good time for a career change.
And, great bringing that maturity and that life experience. So I think that's the challenge. I think the changing culture, the culture that's changing rapidly around us, where at one time I think, the church and Christian schooling, there'd be a level of understanding and respect for what they were trying to accomplish. I think things are changing rapidly in the world around us. And it's, I guess, for one of the challenges, I think, in Christian schooling is to be able to maintain God's call upon our lives and the vision that we have in the midst of a rapidly changing culture.
Yeah, we're picking up students who are teachers doing postgraduate studies with us, doing like 4-unit certificates on biblical studies. They're just wanting to strengthen their Bible-based, Christ-centered, Spirit-infused worldview, and picking up another layer of cultural intelligence, even around the area of public theology, because the world has changed, hasn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
The world has changed.
Yeah. I think it's also the formation, Andrew, and that's where what you're talking about comes in. That it's one thing to be a Christian, to be born again, to believe in God, love God. It's another one to understand what that means and how that's outworked. And the world we're in argues primarily do no harm. That's the moral principle behind it. So do no harm gets interpreted in ways that the Christian view does harm. And we have to educate and train people to understand that that's not the case. That's not right. That's not an accurate interpretation of Scripture. It's not an active outworking of Christian life. Stuart Fowler, who developed the stages of spiritual growth, actually says that the highest level of maturity for a Christian is the ability to be able to engage with somebody else with different views, opposing views, to such an extent that they could actually argue for those opposing views but not have their own faith threatened in any way. In fact, the very highest level, he says, to maybe even learn something that actually does fit and adopt it, if it fits with the Word of God. And not very many Christians are there. We're threatened by people who have different views. We take a closed-fisted approach to it rather than an open-handed approach to it.
That'd be a great antidote to cancel culture, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
And I think the thing that I love in what Craig's talking about there too is that when you understand the Christian worldview, which is one of the things I love about CHC, is that focus on developing a Christian worldview, getting students to think about what their view is, what their worldview is, and how it lines up with the Christian worldview. That doesn't happen in a lot of places, actually. And I think what's happening there at CHC in regards to worldview, I think, is quite outstanding.
It's the home of higher purpose education.
That's it.
Well, you better tell, what do we do if someone decides they want to be a teacher, Craig? I mean, this is not a paid advertorial, but this just comes out of us.
Sorry, I've got my wallet with
me.
me.
You and I talk about this all the time. But there's Bachelor of Education they can do?
Yes, there's Bachelor of
4 years?
Education and Masters of Teaching,
Yeah.
both primary and secondary, with a Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Education. The difference being that you come into a Bachelor of Education not with already a degree, and it's 4 years.
Yeah.
You come into a Masters of Teaching, you've already got an undergraduate degree, and it takes 2 years. But one of the things I'm excited that we've been talking about together, Andrew, is the possibility of a 4-year Bachelor of Ministry, Masters of Teaching, so that the people who are called to minister in churches or plant churches can actually have a bivocational application. And they're so symbiotic. What you learn in how to teach, how to be a teacher, is so relevant to pulpit ministry and pastoral care. We also have an undergraduate certificate in education studies, which allows people who don't feel or can't fulfil the prerequisites for entry into a Bachelor of Education to find another pathway, and it doesn't add any time, any length to the degree. And we're seeing great growth. We were talking earlier before we spoke on mic, but that about the embedded practice model, which is a model whereby schools employ trainee teachers for a couple of days a week as teacher assistants in the classroom, and they study while they're doing that. It takes the same. Yeah,
it's like an apprenticeship model in higher education.
That's exactly what it's like. Yeah, that's right. But it gets the best of both worlds. It gets the academic input and the continuous growth of knowledge. It gets the classroom, but it's applied, and it's applied live in real time with a mentor, and that is exploding for us at Christian Heritage College around Australia, and a lot of interest in it, which is wonderful. And the graduates just come out so ready to teach. And at the same time, schools get the opportunity to look them over and decide whether or not there's a fit.
That's why I love our graduation nights. When it comes to education, it says, this is what they're doing, this is what they're doing, and they've got a job with so-and-so. I think everyone who walks across the stage has already got a job.
That's right. Everyone who wants a job has a job before they graduate pretty much out of education.
High-quality graduates. Yeah. Thank you to you and your team, Craig, for what you've done.
Oh, thank you to you.
And also, to Glenn, for you both. I know that you're the Batman and Robin of
which one are you, Glenn?
Of Peter 12 education, like in a generation. So thanks for your leadership. I know that there are many other voices who speak. We couldn't have Dr. Peter Geiser on. He would have told us about our 4 INC schools with 4,500 students being impacted. But it's been the most wonderful time. I've been inspired even too about a different type of vocational ministry that so is part of church ministry, supports the church, but is also the church in a world that is so desperately looking for hope.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Like this phenomena has almost been an example of the flourishing life, hasn't it? Like
absolutely.
The phenomena of Christian schooling in Queensland, but also too the impact that it's had on families and their development. God bless you both. Thank you.
You too.
Thanks, Andrew.
You too, Andrew.
If you've enjoyed this episode, can you do me just one thing? One favour, please. Can I encourage you to share this with a friend, a colleague, or someone who would be blessed or inspired or challenged by some of the content? I love the guests that we have, and they bring such a richness of them for the benefit of kingdom purpose. So please share it with one friend. God bless you.